Everybody, and thanks for joining us at Secular AZ. Again, you could go ahead and put your name into the chat. We're still struggling with Facebook, so anybody can maybe help us figure out this Facebook problem. Lindsay's ready to tear out all of her hair. But in the meantime, let's talk about what we're really here for. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy, and Secular AZ is your voice for the separation of religion and government. We are a nonprofit organization, and we act as your voice to elected officials all across the state and at every level. So be sure to check out all of our social media channels and like, subscribe, and share. We have great programming on our Fridays. We have all kinds of speakers, historians, authors, elected officials, you name it. Next Friday, we will be speaking with no one because sometimes we just need a break from it all. But the following Friday, April 5th, I hope you'll join us as we speak to Dr. Gretchen Sisson. She is a sociologist who studies abortion and adoption in the United States, and she's the author of Relinquished: The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, coming from St. Martin's Press. So you'll want to maybe pick up a copy of that in the next 2 weeks. We've also got our Secular Day at the Capitol that's happening on the 11th of April. So be sure to register for that. We've got confirmed speakers from all levels of government, including Senator Ana Hernandez. We have abortion activist Sylvia Tamarkin. We've got, let's see, I know I'm missing somebody. Oh, Danette Dunn, who was the vice mayor in Peoria, in the city of Peoria. So you won't want to miss it. Make sure you register. I'm sure Lindsay's throwing all the links in there right now. But for today, I'm really excited. So our speaker today is Rick Pidcock. He grew up in fundamentalist Christianity and led worship in churches for 20 years. He is now a religion writer who publishes weekly analysis articles with Baptist News Global. His writing has also been featured at the American Academy of Religion, the Center for Christogenesis, BioLogos, the Bucks County Beacon, and Real Clear Religion. He has a Master of Arts degree in worship from Northern Seminary, and he is a stay-at-home dad of 5 children. So welcome, Rick. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So you can go ahead and get started anytime you want to. I will monitor the chat, and
Okay.
can't wait to hear you talk.
Let me find my share screen option here. Is that showing up for everybody? Cool.
It is, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about authoritarian Christianity today. And this is a term that Chrissy Stroop recently wrote about that I thought was a really great way of discussing this. We often talk about it as Christian nationalism. And I think the authoritarian Christianity piece brings some different flavors to the conversation that are really helpful. And so what I wanted to do is talk through that, about how the religious right creates power through sacralized hierarchy. And I'll explain all that, but just a little about me to start off with. Like she said, I grew up in independent fundamentalist Baptist world of Christianity. So if you've ever watched the Shiny Happy People documentary on or docuseries on Amazon, that was very much my world growing up. And then I went to Bob Jones University, who has a very rough racist past with segregation and everything. Bans on interracial dating. And I graduated from there with a degree in Bible in 2004, and then spent the next 20 years leading worship in churches. And then also I was in the cleaning industry. So I had this interesting perspective where I was in the upper rooms of the white evangelical churches, but I was also at the very underside of cleaning their restrooms and their floors and everything. So I saw a lot of interesting power dynamics with that. And basically what happened was in 2015, I went through this worship school, and they told me that I needed to have God awareness and self-awareness. And I had no questions at the time about God. I thought to myself, well, my God awareness is totally fine, but I've never thought about self-awareness before. And so basically, over the next few years, I really started delving into self-awareness. And as I got to know myself, I started to learn to actually love myself and have compassion for myself. And then in learning to have compassion and love for myself, I began to have compassion and love for my neighbor. And when that started to happen, this God awareness that I was so confident of began to crumble. And so that self-awareness piece, I mention it here because it's such an important piece that's going to, you'll see it kind of stringing throughout the presentation here. So I ended up from there getting a master's degree in worship from Northern Seminary, and then eventually became a stay-at-home dad. My wife went to work full-time, and we just reversed the roles. And then through that, I was able to pursue my dream of writing and everything. So, and then I write for weekly for Baptist News Global, and they're a progressive Christian organization. I'm not a Baptist, but they give me a great platform to do my stuff. So where are we going with this? I'd like to spend a little bit of time just briefly going over some of the latest headlines with authoritarian Christianity, and then discuss a few opposing strategies that people are using. But then I really want to focus in on developing a theological map from ancient hierarchies to modern authoritarian Christianity that I think will be helpful in helping us kind of see where are these people coming from, and what are they doing that they might not even be aware that they're doing, and their own lack of self-awareness. So with the latest headlines, these are some of the stories that I've written on recently. Obviously, there's a lot more going on than just this, but you had Mike Johnson. He did this retreat. It was a prayer retreat for Republicans to discuss their strategy for keeping the House. And there were some Republicans who were complaining, saying, like, I'm not here to go to church. I'm here to actually work in the government. And but that was an interesting story. And then you had the Alabama judiciary-led revival. So you had the justice that was talking about the IVF, all that stuff. But he was also, in his comments, he was talking about how we need to seek revival as a nation, and we need to have, he's introducing justices and judges to people who are revival experts in order to try to gin up this revival in America led by judges. And then also another piece in this the story here that I wrote talked about the violent retribution against those who don't submit. So you're seeing a lot of these things, like Charlie Kirk is calling for the death penalty for some of Trump's political opponents, and he's talking about things like broadcasting it on TV, and they're debating, should 12-year-olds or 16-year-olds be able to watch it? And or even like John Oliver is recently, that people are calling for John Oliver to go to prison because he's offering $1 million to Supreme Court justice to resign because he's the justice is having all kinds of compromises with his own financial background and stuff. So there's these calls for this just imprison everybody who disagrees with Trump, or even outright kill them. We had the recent story with Next Benedict, and then Tom Woods responding to their death by saying, we want that filth out of Oklahoma, and we are a Christian state, we are a moral state. And then we also have this piece of people's fascination with Russia. These evangelicals who used to be terrified of Russia, now they're all really fascinated by it because of Russia's policies against LGBTQ people. And so I strung some of those. There was a week there, it was just really rough. So I just strung some of those stories together and then was like, what are we seeing here? It feels like, this is again something Chrissy Stroop had mentioned. She said that it feels like America is turning into a Christian school. And that's where I was being reminded of my time at Bob Jones University just by reading the news. The next one, we've got obviously the 10 Commandments bill, and that you guys are familiar with. And Senator Anthony Kern said that the progressive slide down in our country right now is because we have taken the 10 Commandments away from our schools. So in this story, I basically was like, okay, you guys want us to read the 10 Commandments? Let's read the 10 Commandments, and then let's examine, like, what were they and what were they doing, and how do evangelicals hold the 10 Commandments? It's interesting. They actually, in evangelical theology, they believe the 10 Commandments and the law are there to shame us, to show us how unholy we are and how we could never stand up to God's standard and live up to God's standard. So are they wanting to import that into public schools? Because that's exactly what they're doing with the Good News Clubs. And so I kind of get into the 10 Commandments and some of the things going around with that. We also have this recent story where Charlie Kirk said that our government was based on the book of Deuteronomy. And so I look into the history there of how this lie has been spread throughout conservative Christians, that the US government was based on Deuteronomy. Where did that come from? And then also I look into why do these people resonate with Deuteronomy? Like, of all the books of the Bible, why Deuteronomy? And we talk about how the book of Deuteronomy, biblical scholars believe, introduces the next few books of the Bible, which are the Deuteronomistic history books that get into the Canaanite conquest and all of that. So you notice a lot of these evangelical Christians today, they're doing Jericho marches. They're talking about conquest of Canaan. We have a whole American history of Christians using these conquest narratives to justify genocide against Native Americans. So there are reasons why they pick Deuteronomy and say that our Constitution was based off of Deuteronomy. So that article gets into some of that. Some of the opposing strategies that people are using, obviously challenging on legal grounds in the separation of church and state. We shouldn't be establishing a religion. That's one way to do it. Also, another way is calling for equal access. And this is something that I wrote an article about the Satanic Temple recently, where they are going into these places where the Good News Clubs are hosting after school programs, and they're starting an after school Satan club and they're saying, okay, we'll accept your idea of that a religion can do this in a public school, but then if you're going to allow them to do it, you have to allow us to do it. And then some of the evangelicals are like, wait a minute, you realize, like, they can actually do this, and it's actually working. So that's another way to oppose it. There's also content creation. You'd be surprised at how in evangelical and Mormon spaces, especially, people are freaking out about people, ex-evangelicals and ex-Mormons on social media, and they demonize them. So actually this week's story I wrote explores an online conversation with some ex-Mormons and ex-evangelicals and current evangelicals online, and talks about how some of the conversations that are going on there. And then also theological analysis, which is what I'm going to get into a bit more today. And with one of the content creation pieces, obviously, like, documentaries are really growing today. Docuseries are really growing today. You see, like, the Let Us Pray docuseries or the Shiny Happy People. It's a great way to explore some of these abusive authoritarian religions. And there's one out recently called God and Country. And the director, Dan Partland, was on a interview with the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And he said, we have to deliver the point that this is not Christianity, but a political movement, and prohibit the Christian nationalists from hiding behind the shield of saying, this is my faith. What we need to correct for is the assertion that this has anything to do with religion. And so this is a documentary that's trying to oppose Christian nationalism. And it uses people like Anthony Butler or Kristen Dumais, who has some really good points to share. But then it uses a lot of conservative evangelicals that are, like, saying this is not true Christianity. It's like the no true Scotsman thing. If you were a true Christian, everything would be perfect and everything. And what Partland was saying in that interview is we need to show that this has nothing to do with religion. And I just fundamentally disagree with him. Like, I'm appreciative of the documentary trying to address the problem with authoritarian Christianity, but if you take the theology piece and the religion piece out of it, you've completely taken away or you're failing to deal with the root of the problem. I think we need to take these Christian nationalists seriously enough, maybe in a way respect them enough to take them at their word when they tell us that their theology is informing what they're doing, and not just say, oh no, it has nothing to do with what you're doing, because they're telling us that it does, and it obviously does. And so what I'd like to do in this presentation is basically go through mapping how ancient hierarchies translated into the modern theology that is being present in this authoritarian Christianity. So first of all, ancient hierarchies. There were a lot of different hierarchies in the ancient world. You had national hierarchies, which obviously, in a world of empires, you had all of these empires with, smaller nations below them that were either taken into exile or, had to serve them as slaves. So there was a hierarchy of nations. There were also social hierarchies. There were family hierarchies, and then finally theological hierarchies. So we're going to start off with the national hierarchies, and specifically with the story of Israel, because this is the one that concerns today's evangelicals. And so in the Hebrew Bible, Israel had this desire for a land, a temple, and a king. And you see this even playing out in the first chapters of Genesis, where it's a land, Eden. It's the man and woman are there to rule as kings, and it's written in a very temple like language. And so you see that even in this, metaphorically in some of these stories. But then you have Israel's wound of exile from the underside of hierarchy, whether that is through Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, or Roman empires. Israel throughout the Hebrew Bible is struggling with this wound of exile from the land that they love, where they would rule and where they would have their temple. And you see that played out in the Genesis narratives as well, as Adam and Eve are exiled from their place. It's all them processing their wounds of exile. And so what you had is, when you had these national hierarchies of these nations, one above the other, they would enter into these treaties called suzerain vassal treaties, where the empire nation would protect and watch over the smaller nation, as long as the smaller nation abided by the treaty and abided by the stipulations. And if they did, there would be blessings. If they didn't, there would be cursings. And so it was just the culture. It was the way things operated back then. So then you get into the Greco-Roman world, where the Gospels and the epistles were written. And again, you have these social hierarchies. So you may have the imperial family at the top, and it goes down through these Roman cultural social structures down to freed slaves, and then eventually slaves at the bottom. And you can see all of this is it's all just a hierarchy. And in his book, Four Portraits, One Jesus, Mark Strauss, he's a New Testament scholar, he says, everyone knew their place in life, who was above them and who was below them. Democratic values of equality and equal rights were almost non-existent. Though people certainly had ambition, the greatest goal in life was not to climb the socioeconomic ladder, but to protect the status quo. This was done by serving those above you and exercising authority over those below. And so notice those dynamics. Those who are at the bottom, they serve those above them, and those who are at the top, they have dominion and exercise authority over those below them. This was Roman culture. And that was the world that the early Christians were coming together in, is people within different parts of that hierarchy having to figure out how to get along. So the next one is the ancient family hierarchies. So a common term you'll often hear evangelicals talk about is biblical marriage. It's between one man, one woman for life, monogamous, heterosexual, all this kind of stuff. They have all these assumptions about what biblical marriage supposedly is. But it's interesting if you actually look at the Hebrew text. Beth Allison Barr says in her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, neither the word marriage nor the word wife appear in the Hebrew text. And Sandra Richter is another Hebrew scholar. She says that marriage in the ancient world is very different from marriage in our world. Marriage was not the individual choice of two adults of legal age based on chemistry and compatibility. Marriage was an alliance between two families designed to distribute wealth in a mutually beneficial fashion. Even when chemistry was in the mix, economic advantage was still the controlling objective. The purpose of marriage was to provide legitimate heirs for the household. And so this is just fundamentally not at all what conservative evangelicals are talking about when they talk about biblical marriage. They don't realize how culturally situated marriage, even in the Hebrew Bible, was into this ancient world. And Jennifer Bird, she says, perhaps most telling for our conversation is that both versions of the 10th commandment about not coveting list a man's woman among his possessions. In both cases, it is clear that a woman is property and not on equal standing with her man. And so a lot of these, again, evangelicals will talk about don't commit adultery. You have to be monogamous. You can't have sex before marriage, and all this kind of stuff. But if you actually look at the Hebrew Bible and you think about it in terms of this ancient hierarchical property world, a lot of the commands about adultery they're not about or they're about taking another man's wife, like the woman is just the property. Marriage is taking a woman to be your wife. Adultery is taking another man's wife. Prohibitions against homosexuality, it's all written in terms of someone's property of another man, and a man can't be a property of another man. And so it's all just mixed in with this ancient culture, and it has nothing to do with this unenculturated revelation of God. So when we get more towards the epistles of Paul, we get into the household codes of the Greco-Roman world. And Aristotle in the 4th century, he said the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The one rules and the other is ruled. Of household management, we have seen that there are 3 parts. One is the rule of a master over slaves, another of a father, and the third of a husband. A husband and a father rules over wife and children. So it's interesting when you look at these epistles in what Christians would call the New Testament, these passages about marriage, and they'll point to, it's like a picture of Christ in the church, marriage between a man and a woman. That's why it has to be a heterosexual marriage, and why men have to be the head of the woman. If you look at those passages, they actually are written as ancient household codes, where you have the master over the slave, the husband over the wife, and the parents and the father over the children. And so conservative evangelicals just, again, lack the self-awareness that this is what Paul was writing in, that these were not categories revealed to them by God that means men have to be in charge of women. These were ancient Roman categories, and Paul was operating within those worlds and within those assumptions. So the Hebrew law and the prophets were written as a national hierarchy between Yahweh and the nation of Israel. And this is really fascinating. I get into this with the 10 Commandments article because if you look at the 10 Commandments, the way it's structured with this, a preamble, a historical prologue, the stipulations of the covenant, the witnesses, and then the curses and the blessings, like all of those were all formulations that ancient nations used between empires and smaller nations. And that's how the 10 Commandments and the law is structured between Yahweh and Israel. And so again, conservatives have no idea how culturally formed their law was. They consider the law as God's perfect standard revealed to us. That's not at all what it was. It was an ancient treaty. The epistles were written to sort out the social hierarchies that were clashing in the church, because obviously as Jews and Gentiles are becoming Christians, as people throughout these hierarchies are getting together and they're meeting in homes, there's going to be some power dynamics there. There's going to be some awkward tension going on there. And so a lot of the epistles were trying to sort out the mess that was happening in those situations. And then biblical families, if there is such a thing, it was more of an evolution. Like you can see throughout the Hebrew Bible into the epistles, how they evolved within these patriarchal hierarchies and then into household code hierarchies later. And so I share all that to say that the biblical authors had a very complicated relationship with hierarchy. At times they were assuming hierarchy. At times they were affirming it. Sometimes they were subverting it in ways by emphasizing those on the underside of hierarchy. Sometimes they were evolving it in some way to some perhaps more healthy version of it. And so they're not always promoting hierarchy. They're not always being the good guys on the underside of hierarchy. It was complicated. Also, a lot of it was shaped by the relationship of Israel to exile. And that, again, that's another complication, because on one hand, Israel was victims of the Babylonian exile and the Assyrian exile. But at the other hand, they were writing about committing genocide against the Canaanites. And so it's complicated there. And also the social location of the writers is complicated, because you may have a Paul who was very educated in his writing of the epistles, but then you have people in exile in the Hebrew Bible that were more on the underside of power, but then they may have been more privileged because they actually knew how to write and different things like that. So there's just a lot of dynamics at play within the Bible related to these ancient hierarchies. And today's conservative interpreters just lack awareness for how these dynamics shaped the biblical text. Instead, these conservative evangelicals talk about the Bible as this top-down, inerrant, perfect, clear revelation dictated to humanity by God. And that's just not at all what the Bible is or how it played out. So now I want to get into the applying these theological hierarchies. And one idea is that they have creation as a hierarchy of dominion. We see this in Genesis 1, where it says, then God said, let us make humans in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea. Notice this hierarchical language. And over the birds of the I guess I should have said air there, not the fire, and over the cattle and over the wild animals and of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. I remember when I was a conservative, I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, Dennis Prager, all those guys every day. And Rush Limbaugh would always point to this verse as a way of promoting science denial and dismissing climate change, concerns for the climate. And he would say, we're to have dominion over the earth. And so we need to just drill wherever we want to drill. And all of it was based on this hierarchy of humans having authority over the earth and the earth having to submit and serve the concerns of the humans, which in a hierarchical structure ultimately becomes destructive. So we had creation as a hierarchy of dominion, and that's where a lot of these science denial things come in, and people not trusting scientists because scientists have a different narrative about the cosmos. And so therefore, when scientists bring in evolution and quantum physics and all this kind of stuff, evangelicals are like, well, you're trying to take the cosmos out of the dominion service thing. And so it's an attack on the authority of God, because scientists supposedly just want to live however they want, and not submit to God. So it all goes back to hierarchy. Worship is a hierarchy of service. And again, go back to this quote by Mark Strauss, that everyone knew their place in life and their responsibilities were serving those above you and exercising over the authority over those below. That's worship language. So notice how that plays out in the definitions of worship. You've got all these words in the Hebrew language for worship that mean things like loyal service, obedience to commands, serving humans or divine rulers, bowing down, doing homage. And then one scholar, Andrew Hill, says he defines worship as a vassal's submission and loyalty to the authority of the overlord. I always laugh when I see this one, because you got all these mega churches today with the fog machines and the lights, and people aren't necessarily thinking in terms of this ancient Near Eastern language about the authority of the overlords. But that's exactly the dynamics that we're talking about here with worship. And then also gender roles as a hierarchy of male dominion and female service. So again, these people are going to promote men being in charge of women. Men are the heads. Men get to have their vision for life, and then women are the helpers to help the men accomplish their vision. John MacArthur, he's a pastor in Los Angeles who was involved with the he made the news, especially recently, with denying COVID restrictions, and they had thousands of people in there unmasked, unsocially distanced in their congregation. And so he said, authority and submission pervade the whole universe. In the relationship between man and man, there is authority and submission. In the relationship between man and God, there is authority and submission. In the relationship between God and God, there is authority and submission. The entire universe is pervaded by this concept. And what is new here is not that the wife is subject to her husband. That isn't new, because the Old Testament taught that. What is new is the vastness, the scope of this principle, that it absolutely pervades everything. And so what they're doing is, there's this book, this library of books called the Bible, that was written in this ancient authority and submission hierarchy world. These people have no clue how culturally situated the dynamics were. And these writers within it have all kinds of complicated relationships to hierarchy. And they're basically taking that as the literal revelation of God, that the entire cosmos is about authority and submission, and that it absolutely pervades everything, especially with men being in charge of women. And John MacArthur, again, one of his big things, he doesn't even want women to be pastors. And he talks about, he went after Beth Moore a couple years ago and told her to go home, and because she's a evangelical evangelist basically. And he said that these women who want to be pastors in the evangelical world, he said they're seeking the highest authority. They're seeking to ascend to the highest authority. Again, it's all hierarchy language of ascending to authority. And then the final piece here is the spiritual warfare as hierarchy of theopolitical cosmology. So again, in a book called Scripture and Cosmology, think about your model of the universe. We think about a global Earth. We think about an ancient universe of becoming and evolving over time. Well, that's not how the biblical writers thought about the universe. Kyle Greenwood says the Mesopotamians thought of the upper heavens as a physical realm above the upper waters. Its floor was solid, enabling its residents to stand, sit, or otherwise conduct their affairs. Matters in the upper heavens paralleled matters on earth, such that when a king presented himself before the altar of Shamash in that god's temple, it was as if he were standing before the throne of the god above the firmament. So there's a parallel between the spiritual realm up here and the earthly realm up here. And whatever's going on down here is really about what's going on up there. And this is not just in the ancient Near East. I've found this in some of the Asian cultures as well. In a book called China Root, Taoism, Chan, and the Original Zen, David Hinton says that the Shang dynasty was fiercely patriarchal. In the Shang, it was believed that all things were created and controlled by a male and all-powerful monotheistic deity, very like the sky god of Judeo-Christian theology, a deity simply known as Lord Celestial, the high ancestor of the Shang's male rulers. Hence, Lord Celestial provided those rulers with a transcendental source of legitimacy through lineage, and it gave them godlike power because through prayer and ritual, there's that worship piece, they could influence Lord Celestial's shaping of events. All aspects of people's lives were thus controlled by the emperor: weather, harvest, politics, economics, religion, etc. Indeed, as in the traditional West, people didn't experience themselves as substantially different from spirits, for the human realm was simply an earthly extension of the spirit realm. And so there's, again, they saw the spiritual world up in the sky as being paralleled in this human world. And so really what's going on in human politics is being spoken about in spiritualized language about the gods. So who is the highest emperor on the earth is really about who is the highest God, the God most high. And once you see that language, you can't unsee it all throughout even the Bible. Bragging about which God is the highest. And so now we put that into modern politics. And one of the problems we have here is that there's so much variety in the authoritarian Christians today. One of them is the independent charismatics and these people believe in the authority of the apostles and prophets. They believe that apostles are here today. Prophets are making these prophecies about American politics, and their goal is dominion. You've probably heard about the 7 Mountain Mandate. I'm sure you've had speakers on here talking about that, about Christians putting themselves in positions of dominion over those those areas of society. When they said that Trump, because he was on Celebrity Apprentice, Trump supposedly had conquered the media dominion, and then he had conquered the business world, and so they thought, well, we should put him in charge of the government, and then evangelicals will have control of 3 of the mountains through Trump. And that's basically these independent charismatics. These were the people who were really involved with the New Apostolic Reformation support of the January 6th riots. These people were in the White House. during the time between the election and the riots. They were there in the days leading up to the riots. They had I wrote an article there that had 4 of the 6 protest permits at January 6th were these New Apostolic Reformation people. So that's one group of people. Then you have the mainstream conservative evangelicals. So these are people like Al Mohler. These are Southern Baptists. So like Al Mohler doesn't believe in speaking in tongues. He doesn't do the whole Mount Everest fight off the demon thing that the independent charismatics did a couple decades ago, where they literally climbed Mount Everest to fight a ice queen on this invisible castle. Like Al Mohler would say, that's ridiculous. I don't believe that stuff is real. But Al Mohler still believes in hierarchy. He just, rather than apostles and prophets, he believes in elders and husbands. So only men can be pastors. Only men are elders in charge of churches, and husbands are in charge of their families. And so he talks a lot about the created order, and then he in politics he talks about ordered liberty, and he promotes he talks about how adultery and homosexuality should be illegal. This is a guy with a lot of power in the Southern Baptist Church, and so I wrote an article there about that whole concept with him. And then the final piece here is what some people refer to as sonic warfare, and it's kind of a fancy way of basically these worship leaders who, if you look at the independent charismatics and the conservative evangelicals, despite their theological disagreements about, prophecy and all that, they each believe in a hierarchy, an authoritarian structure of the entire cosmos. They each think that evangelicals are supposed to be at the top of it, and they each use worship leaders and Christian music in order to support their spiritual warfare. And so the songs, worship songs, they use a lot of this language about that's very culturally situated. I actually did one piece that didn't really get a lot of reads, but it was about examining the political worship songs of the Civil War. And it was really fascinating to look at Black Christians and white Christians during the Civil War and how different their worship lyrics were, and how Black Christians wrote about being liberated, and they used codes in order to use their songs to literally promote their plans to be escaping slavery and stuff. Whereas white Christians were all about, soldiers marching as to war and, stand up for Jesus, you soldiers of the cross, and all this. It's a very different social location of worship lyrics. And you see that played out today with a lot of the Christian worship is about war and about, it uses language of hierarchy, like I once was a slave, but now I'm a son and a daughter. And it's about work. It's about your way up, going your way up the hierarchy. And so basically all that put together, I got a few quotes here by a few different people, and just notice how this hierarchy language of dominion over and serving those above you plays itself out. So Al Mohler, he said, if America leaves that general Protestant commitment, that general Christian commitment when it comes to the inheritance of the Christian worldview, I do not believe that this experiment in ordered liberty can last. And again, Al Mohler, he's not just promoting, this nuclear family theology. He believes that men should be in charge of the home. So when he's talking about ordered liberty, he's referring to it in this created order framework of men being the leaders of their families and women staying at home and supporting them in whatever their vision for their family is. Jack Prosobiec at CPAC said, welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it and replace it with this right here, he said, holding his fist in the air. And then he said, that's right, because all glory is not to government, all glory to God. It's all glory hierarchy. It's all about submitting to the highest God, which of course is theirs. And then Andrew Walker, he's a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He wrote a piece for the National Review recently called The Case for a Theocentric Right. He said, if our existence is due to divine forces outside of ourselves, autonomy is not humanity's greatest political need. Instead, self-ordering and political ordering around the divine constitute the summum bonum of human existence. So in other words, notice how he changes, he uses, instead of saying freedom is not our greatest desire or political need, but autonomy is not our greatest political need. He's using that word autonomy because he's basically framing everyone who won't submit to their glory hierarchy as those who just want to be autonomous on their own. It's not about being free. It's about, oh, you just don't want to submit to our glory hierarchy. And you instead need to have a self-ordering and a political ordering into our divine glory hierarchy. And then Stephen Wolfe, in the case for Christian nationalism, he said, the issue here centers on whether a Christian minority can establish a political state over the whole. There's that hierarchy language, without the positive consent of the whole. Again, Christians never hear about consent. I was in the world for 35 years and never once heard a sermon on consent. It's about submission and dominion. And you wonder why all their denominations are overcome with sexual abuse scandals. So anyways, he says, whether a Christian minority can establish a political state over the whole without the positive consent of the whole, I affirm they can. Non-Christians living among us are not entitled to a political equality, nor do they have a right to deny the people of God their right to order civil institutions to God and to their complete good. The Christian's posture toward the earth ought to be that it is ours, not theirs, for we are co-heirs in Christ. And there's that. It all ties back to this biblical marriage idea, the ancient culture of how marriage was really about the inheritance. And Christians are the co-heirs with Christ. They get the inheritance, and the inheritance is being politically ordered as having dominion over our nation. And so I don't think that a lot of Christians really have any clue that that is what is, that's the depths of how culturally situated their theology is. And when Dan Partland, I go back to his quote again, he says, what we need to correct for is the assertion that this has anything to do with religion. I'm like, what are you talking about? This whole thing is about religion. It's about how modern conservative Christian religion is a hierarchical view of the cosmos based on ancient hierarchies that are national hierarchies, social hierarchies, family hierarchies, and theological hierarchies. And they just think, oh, God just revealed it to us inerrantly in the Bible. And they have no idea how they're really just promoting ancient empires over their neighbors. And so once you see that, it can get confusing to try to decipher between all these different groups of Christian nationalism, but really they're like, it's almost like a Disney movie where, you have the same plot, you have the same bad guy, the same villains, and you can kind of recognize, oh, here comes the Jafar character. Oh, here's Gaston. It's basically, they have different characters, they have maybe some different storylines, but they're really following the same authoritarian hierarchies, and they're using the same spiritual warfare as people who go against their hierarchy. That's where the spiritual warfare happens, because we got to fight those threats to our hierarchy off, and it hurts the self and it hurts your neighbors, and that's where we're finding ourselves today. And we don't know to what extent they're going to want to try to exercise that over us. So if you want to see more of my writing, you can go to my website, rickpidcock.com, and then I also have a Substack that I put there, and then it just emails you all the different articles that I put out.
Okay, cool. And then Lindsay did put that in the chat for everybody. I haven't seen a lot of questions in the chat, so please feel free. If you do have any questions, go ahead and throw them in there. But I'm curious. I watch all the documentaries and docuseries about religious cults, and so I did watch Shiny Happy People, and I watched Let Us Pray. Let Us Pray was incredibly disturbing. And so growing up in an IFB Church. I'm assuming that you were either homeschooled or went to a church school.
Yes, I went to Christian schools all growing up.
And were you in what region were you in? I'm just curious.
So my parents got married in South Carolina, and then we moved to Michigan, Ohio, Colorado, South Carolina, Georgia, and then back to South Carolina. So
Hmm.
a little bit all over.
Okay. Yeah, that's congratulations on making it out, I guess. It was really terrifying for me and eye-opening. I mean, I grew up without a lot of religion and certainly not evangelical extremist religion like that. So I've just heard so many horrible stories. One thing that you made me think of, and there I see a question is coming in, but it's so funny to me because I also read a lot and watch a lot of documentaries about Mormons, LDS and FLDS, but the Mormons maintain that hierarchy once you get to heaven. Like you
Yeah.
can't even like get into the special level of heaven unless you've got a husband to get you there. It's crazy.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see the parallels between Mormonism and evangelicalism because like we were always told in evangelicalism that Mormons were a cult and they were totally different than us. And yet that when you see the ex-evangelicals and the ex-Mormons discussing with one another, like we see so many parallels in our worlds. And it's really, even though there's doctrinal differences, it's the psychological way they hold over you and the threats they make to keep you in. That's where the similarities are.
Yeah, well, and I mean, then you think about the accumulation of wealth of the LDS Church, and I've known so many. We call them Jack and Jill Mormons out here, because we have a lot of Mormons. And if you're a Jack or a Jill Mormon, it's like you still maybe go to church, but you do have a Pepsi, and maybe you have a glass of wine, and you don't really believe in it. But that network is that safety net is incredible. Like I've known Mormon people who were gifted a house while they were doing a master's program so that so they didn't have to rent the entire time they lived in Arizona. It's bananas.
Yeah, excuse me. And it can be scary. Like I think that's what keeps a lot of people in it is they're one, for some of them, their livelihood depends on it because they're on staff at a church. But also just your social structure. Like we were always told, if you leave the church, what happens if you get cancer? And how are you going to survive? And that can be
Wow.
scary.
Yeah, that's crazy. So Mars has a question. They're asking, Rick, could you say more about your deconversion and the steps to self-awareness that you followed?
Yeah, so basically it was actually really practical. They at the very beginning, what they did is they had us write down on a piece of paper our top 10 high points and hard times in life. And then we began to then put that into like a timeline and begin to like just kind of look at our life as a story and started seeing these different chapters of our lives. And through that, I started noticing like I had no idea how hurt I was. And that night, actually, I just broke down in tears. And I was like, I literally at the table, I said, I had no idea how hurt I was. And then over the next year, I had to read some books by people that I thought were heretics, people like Henry Nouwen or Richard Rohr. And I thought these are people I would never have read before. But all of a sudden, I was learning stuff about myself from people I disagreed with that were really healing for me. And so then basically that was a big part of it was just a spiritual healing of learning to have compassion for myself. And then I began to realize how much of the theology that I believed was what was fueling my wounds. These visions of myself of being unworthy and worthy only of being eternally tormented. That's how evil I am. Like, oh, that's where a lot of my wounds lie, is in the theological scripts I was given. The Bible piece, again, I believed in inerrancy. I thought it was everything happened perfectly as the Bible said. And then I started getting fascinated with how literarily the Bible was structured. And at first I thought, wow, this is a literary work of genius. But then as the more I started looking into that, I started realizing, well, wait a minute, how much of this literally happened? And then if it didn't literally happen, can I really condemn myself and my kids and all of humanity for a guy who actually didn't exist, named Adam, and who was really just ancient Israelite writers processing their wound of exile? How does that mean I gotta, like, how do I have inherited guilt from that? So it was just, it was a real, it was a spiritual inner healing that awakened me up to my neighbor, and then the whole thing just kind of came apart from there.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, I know it's a really difficult process, but I'm glad that you kind of made it through the other side and are doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Farrell is asking, in her book, The Power Worshippers, Catherine Stewart says that evangelicals and the Republicans decided to join forces to promote each of their agendas. Your comment?
Yeah, and that's one of my actual concerns. I agree with that, but again, in hierarchy, so they're going to come together. Evangelicals and Catholics, even when I was in school at Bob Jones, a big concern was evangelicals and Catholics coming together because Bob Jones wanted to be separate from the Catholics, and but they'll come together for political power. Well, okay, well, what's going to happen if they get political power? Both of them believe in a hierarchy. So when the independent charismatics are in the room with the Al Mohlers of the world, then who's going to be in charge within them? Like, they're going to try to then create another hierarchy amongst themselves. And so the whole thing is just going to, however they, because they view world through hierarchy, it's all going to be a power game, even amongst themselves.
Yeah. Let's see. It looks like a comment here. The LDS aren't just wealthy, they're integrated in the government with a heavy presence in cybersecurity as well as the foreign service, as Mormons often speak multiple languages and do missions abroad. They're de facto institutionalizing themselves in some sectors of government often goes unmentioned. I mean, essentially, our government at the Arizona State Legislature, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a large portion of Mormons. You look at your city councils out here, some school boards are entirely Mormon, especially in places like, say, Benson, Arizona, or more rural spaces. Yeah, there's a lot of Mormon ideology, I would say, that drives a lot of the legislation that we see here in Arizona. And obviously a lot of favors to the LDS Church as well.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's a great opportunity for ex-evangelicals and ex-Mormons to begin talking about some of this stuff, because that's a world that is a bit unfamiliar to me as the Mormon side.
And somebody did mention "Thank God I'm Atheist," a podcast. That one sounds good. I'll check it out the next time I'm in a podcast listening mood. Let's see. As of July 2023, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is estimated to be worth 236 billion, with real estate making up about 17% of its assets. That includes nearly 400 mission homes and the Missionary Training Center in Provo, which is worth around $2 billion, as well as unidentified church real estate and investment funds, which are estimated to be around 13 billion. That should terrify all of us, really.
Yeah.
Let's see. Who are the people that hear your message and have their eyes and minds closed? Who can be changed? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's the struggle. A lot of people can't be, they're just not interested in being changed. And I post a lot on Facebook, just kind of stream of thought as things happen throughout the day. And I regularly get messages from people that are like, I can't talk to my family about my deconstructing theology, but what you say resonates with me. And what I like about the Baptist News Global space for me is, um, you know, I can get into some more of the theological controversies to show people like what's going on with the Ten Commandments or what's going on with the Book of Deuteronomy theologically, that like a CNN might not want to put an article out there about. But it's good to be able to create these pieces for people who can then share with their family to plant seeds of doubt. Because when you're planting these seeds of doubt, eventually the house of cards has to fall for some of them.
Mm-hmm. I was looking you up on Facebook, sorry. Let's
Yeah,
see.
you're good.
This is good. With that kind of money, the LDS could buy Trump, but I'm
Yeah.
much. Good job. All right. Let's
And
see.
that's actually one of my concerns, is that we can get so fascinated with Trump that we don't realize that Trump is actually kind of a pawn in this greater Mormon slash evangelical thing going on of authoritarian Christianity. Because when Trump is gone, which will happen at some point, it's still, authoritarian Christianity is still going to be here, and they'll find somebody else to to bring up.
Yep, absolutely. Let's see. And Mars says the Trump administration will change 501c3 laws so the LDS can do that. Probably. Let's see. Project 2025. Okay, yep. Let's see. Give me 1 second. Here's a quote. I've never seen any transformation that didn't begin with the person in question finally getting tired of their own bullshit, from Elizabeth Gilbert. That's a good one. Okay, and now Philip is asking, Rick, why do you think science denial is so prevalent in this nation? As a science educator for most of my career, I suspect part of the reason is that science is complex and difficult to understand, and most people don't want to expend the effort necessary to comprehend it. What do you think?
I definitely agree with that. And it's hard for me because a lot of pieces online, like stories, are so sensationalized that it's hard for me to know if I go out and I'll share this article with my evangelical neighbors only to find out that it was something sensationalized, which that's hard for me. But I think a big reason why they refuse to listen to scientists goes back to the hierarchy thing, because the creation to them is all a hierarchy. It's about submitting to what God has revealed, and in order to uphold God's authority over you. And so and God's authority, because the spiritual realm and the earthly realm are paralleled, it's really about their authority. And so I think they don't want to lose that authority piece, because then they're going to feel very insecure about themselves, and they're going to lose their control over everyone.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it is 12:57, and typically on Fridays, because this is heavy information, we talk to a lot of people who talk about Seven Mountain Mandates and the
Yeah,
IFB and all kinds of stuff, and it's Friday. So we want to try to maybe have fun. I'll be at the Rainbows Festival, which is probably the second largest LGBTQ festival in Phoenix. So hopefully y'all will stop by at our booth. That'll give me some hope. But what gives you hope when you are just like digging deep into this kind of stuff? How do you not just, sink into the pit of despair?
yeah, it can be easy. I just try to I enjoy my life, and I enjoy getting to know the people that I love and care about. And I've got 5 kids to keep me distracted, and we've got some people coming over for dinner tonight that I met through this process that I wouldn't have known and been friends with had I not began to ask these questions. So I've got a dinner with friends tonight that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
And that's kind of where I'm at too, right? Like, because I know that on Sunday, when I start looking at what bills are going to be going through the legislature, that I'm not going to be feeling great. And so I've been invited to a nice little wine tasting, and I have a new grandbaby. So
Nice.
my big goal this weekend is to get over there so I can hold and smell the baby. So all right. Well, thank you so much, Rick. This was great. And I did request your friendship. I'm looking forward to following you. And this was a really, really great discussion. You gave me a lot to think about as I deal with these men who are making all these
Yeah.
decisions and trying to understand where they're coming from. So thanks so much. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Take care.